So today's topic is, it's going to be the first of my Tuesday talks here at 6:30 Central Time Zone. Welcome to those who want to learn more about what I do here. So today's topic is, all right, I'm live on YouTube. First of my Tuesday talks here. Okay, live on YouTube as well. Welcome everybody. Tuesday talks. This is the first Tuesday talk. The topic is 100 trillion ways of being. The question I want to ask you first here is reality, is it one or is it infinite? Is it in an infinite number of different things interacting with one another? Or is it one cohesive whole that we all are? Is it a cohesive whole that everybody is? And then I want to ask you, so you might choose one, okay, it's all one, or it's an infinite amount of different parts, right? You could say though, that's possible that it's both. It's possible that there could be simultaneously, it's one gigantic thing, one gigantic consciousness, but also within that, simultaneously, paradoxically, there are an infinite amount of ways of being. So the reason why I want to use the phrase ways of being or a way of being versus a thing. So we have like thingness, which is static. Sorry about that. Which is static. It has a specific essence to it. You can describe it and it needs to be a certain way, right? However, when you see everything as a verb, so being, for example, beingness, that's actually a verb, and it's an ing word, being, which is different for example, I speak a little bit of Spanish too. The word they would use for that is ser, which is to be. So that has a static way of seeing the world, where everything is, meaning that it's maybe not changing. So for example, a chair, it just is the way a chair is, right? How do you describe a chair? It's chairness. But what if you see that a chair is actually a way of being inside of consciousness? A way of being inside of consciousness. And actually the chair does not really fit. It's not equal to its definition. So this chair, the one I'm pointing to in my room, it's unique. It's made of certain materials. Someone in Canada made it. I'm attached to this chair, not another one. So it's actually not the same chair as another chair, which is pretty obvious. But the point I'm trying to get to is that's a unique chair. So what makes that unique from another chair, even though we call them both chairs? So now extrapolate that with something more complex, like animals. So we see animals, we describe them as a way of, that it's a thing, right? Like elephant, like that's an elephant. But does an elephant, and the way that it is, the way that it's being, does it identify as our definition of it? Again, kind of going back to this point. When you are something, you simply are being it. You're simply performing a way of being. You don't really know what you are, how in the way that the human or people would define you. So when you go to Africa and you go on a safari, and you see a beautiful big elephant, and you're just amazed. But you had this idea of what an elephant could have been, right? You had this idea, maybe what you learned in biology class growing up, how an elephant is. And you have all of these characteristics of what an elephant is versus, and you have to compare and contrast what is the difference between an elephant and a giraffe, right? To know what an elephant is, you have to know what is not an elephant. Basically, everything that is not an elephant, you can compare that with elephantness. Now, going back to that experience of the safari, that very way of being, that elephant is a way of being, it's not an elephant, right? Your experience, your way of being is as experience, right? Because what I'm getting at is you are a way of being, you aren't not an identity, is how I'm getting at. So you as a way of being, in philosophy, there's one of my favorite philosophers is Martin Heidegger. He uses the term Dasein for this. So I'll talk about that in a second. But Dasein, or way of being in the world. You are a way of being in the world, experiencing another way of being. Okay. So the elephant is being itself. You are being itself through experience. Right? So the first thing that we should note is all that's happening, all you know is that there is experience, or you could call it consciousness, right? Consciousness and experience. And then within that, somehow there's also ways of being, different ways of being. Because your way of being, I would say, I'm going to talk about this too. There are 100 trillion. I didn't use the word infinity because I don't think humans can understand infinity. So I just gave it a random number, a random huge number, 100 trillion. But everything is different levels of 100 trillion. So there are 100 trillion, 100 trillions, just like there are an infinite amount of infinities. You are an infinity. You are a 100 trillion. That makes sense. Throughout your life, or let's continue thinking about the elephant. The elephant is living its life through its experience, not of elephantness, not the way humans define it, right? Through sheer, just, it is. It is being, right? It, like I said, is not the right word. Being, it's being. And it's been being in a unique way for its whole life. So the life aspect, or the experience, that's the oneness that I was talking about at the beginning of this talk, is the oneness of it. So yes, everything is connected through experience, consciousness, or reality, right? You could, I don't know what word you want to give that, but kind of the background that everything happens inside of. And the things that I'm talking about are not things. People are not things. People are not even people. On one level, people, yes, when you're in the story of language, when you're in the video game of life, it seems like people are just who they are. And that the way you describe Steve, using Steve as an example, there are, if you want to see a funny, watch a funny song, I've mentioned this before on this channel, go listen to the song I Am Steve. A really funny song, I Am Steve, basically says there are a million of us Steves, right? So there are 10 trillion ways that you are. So you, first of all, you are, but not your identity, you are your experience. You are just experience, not even yours, right? We're all in this experience together. We're all in this space. It's not even space, it's just pure awareness, you could say. And that's the oneness. And within that, within your life, you have been 100 trillion ways. And if you include your future, that's also a part of your 100 trillion ways of being. Okay, so elephants, plants, chairs, Personalities, even your personality, it's not you, it's not a thing that you can point to. Like, I don't think anything is actually tangible. Like, can you actually point to things and say, that's exactly that the way that it is? For example, take the chair. Okay. Instead of describing it, right, it's much easier, because that's hard. It's hard to describe a chair, right? With making it unique from other chairs. How do you say this chair is special through description of all of these other, bunch of chairs? But that one's unique. It's unique because it's a certain way of being. It's not the same way of being as all of the other chairs, right? And that's the same with, like, as we get more complex, we want to start talking about humans rather than chairs, obviously, right? So humans, like I said, you have been 100 trillion ways of being, but that includes emotions that you've had, the 100 trillion emotions that you have and will have. Thoughts, 100 trillion thoughts that you have had and you will have. Then all of these people in the world, then you combine it. So not just you, 100 trillion way of being inside of yourself, but then everyone else is a 100 trillion way of being as well. So it starts to get extremely, extremely complicated, extremely complex. So complex that we don't even want to use the word 100 trillion, because that quantifies a certain amount, right? There's a limit to that. So it's actually more accurate to use infinity. But even though we're talking about the infinity of all infinities, right? And beyond that. So if you put all of the infinities that you can think of into one set, and you say, okay, now this set is the ultimate infinity, the infinity of all infinities, the capital I infinity, that which everything happens inside of. But see how that can also be in another set of infinity? So even 100 trillion times 100 trillion times 100 trillion. So then you have 100 trillion to the power of the 100 trillionth. That has a limit, because you can always have a set of another set, right? There can always be more. So that's the complex part of it, is the way all of these ways of being are Dasein. So let me quickly explain what I mean by Dasein. So it's Dasein. And I do have a video on my YouTube channel about this. So Dasein, Martin Heidegger. I describe basically Dasein means being. So instead of thinking of ways of being, take being and then in the world. So Da means existence, and then Sein means like here, basically, or here in the world. Okay. So that chair that you're talking about, it's for the chair, it's here, right? For me, it's there, but for the chair, from the chair's perspective, you could say, it's experiencing its way of being here for it. So for you, you are experiencing your Dasein. For me, over there. Okay, so for me, I'm a specific Dasein, but I've been 100 trillion Daseins. And I will continue to be within those 100 trillion Daseins. Okay. And like I said, that's true and what I mean by why I have been those 100 trillion ways of being is, like I said, emotions, all of the emotions I felt, all of the thoughts I've had, all of the attachments I've been attached to, all of the moments, okay, 100 trillion moments. So you could either see it as, okay, life happens in time, you could say. Life happens in time. And that time is divided by moments. So what is a moment? Say a moment is between 2 to 10 seconds. That's how we experience moments. You could say is in frames of moments, but that would go ad infinitum all the way to infinity, right? So you have all of these, but from your perspective, right, from your birth to your death. Okay, but you could say even if time were infinite, if you believe in time, because we experience time, right? So it's hard not to believe in it. That you could split it up into an infinite amount, 100 trillion moments. Okay, and each one is a Dasein, or a way of being. So ultimately, if this is true for us, that we have 100 trillion ways of being, other people are experiencing 100 trillion ways of being. They're not one way. You are not one way. Donald Trump is not one way. Nobody. Nobody is just one way. So here's the pitch. This way of seeing the world leads to open-mindedness. Leads to an extremely open-minded way of seeing reality. Because you see that everyone is constantly fresh. Everything is constantly fresh. You could either say now, or you could say outside of time. What I mean by that is, if you're in time, and it doesn't really matter whether you are experiencing inside of time or outside of time. Like I said, inside of time, there are 10 trillion moments or ways of being, not just for everybody, but for each person. If you're outside of time, right, everything's constantly changing and reforming, and everything's recycling with one another. That leads to a more sense of like oneness, right? So at that point, like, you have 100 trillion or infinity, and it gets so big that it just like circles back to one. Or you could say zero. I've heard some people say it's actually not that we're all one, it's that we're all zero. Whichever works for you. I think both are true. We are one, we are zero, and we are 100 trillion. We are infinite. We are infinite to the infinite power, etc. I think all of those are true. So returning back to the open-mindedness. So think of somebody that you have hated, or someone that, maybe hate's a strong word, right? That's what they say. So someone that you just kind of dislike, that the way that they are. Okay. So we get mad at the way we identify them, the way they make us feel at that moment when we're interacting with them. We even judge ourselves that way. We judge ourselves through identifying. We judge ourselves through thinking that we just are a certain way, and that's never going to change. And the way that things are is just one way, right? It's just a closed-minded way of seeing who you are, not being able to see that you have an infinite potential of being who you are. Just kind of organizing here. Screen. Again, this is my first Tuesday talk, so I'm figuring out the technology. All right. Looks like someone said hi. All right, so the open-mindedness piece comes when you see that someone else that you dislike is not the way that you perceive them. But in reality, even though you could say there isn't an ultimate reality that we could all agree on, because everything is just a different Dasein, or everything is just a different 100 trillion ways of being. But that person is a Dasein, but is 100 trillion Daseins. So how can you judge someone, again, only by identifying or judging their identity based on your perception and not who they are? Because who they are, they might not even know who they are. because they're an enlightened Dasein. Daseins are simply, there's just enlightenment, right? Reality is enlightenment. It's just a matter of seeing it, living it, and claiming it or embodying it. It's not like, yeah, it's simply that, right? So everything is equally a Dasein. It's not like ultimately someone is a better Dasein than another, because it's all a sort of Dasein or way of being. Let me try to move this stuff. Oh, I'm gonna minimize this. Okay. Yeah, good to see you, CJ. And then Kinderhood. I had to move my screen to see everybody. So yes. So when you see the world as a way of being, it gets harder and harder to judge things negatively, or even judge things better than another thing, right? For there to be something bad, there needs to be something good. Okay, so bad with a small b and good with a small g, meaning that it's relative. Because ultimately, when you begin to see the world as there are 100 trillion ways of being, and everything is just within another set of a bigger 100 trillion ways of being, you begin to see that everything is relative. Absolutely everything is relative. And that everything's kind of based on perspective, the way that we even see reality. Even ultimate reality is a way of being. It's just one way of being within the 100 trillion times 100 trillion times 100 trillion. It's simply one way of being. It's not even better than our ignorant, from our perspective, we experience it as ignorant. It's not better than our way of suffering. So like for us, we experience suffering, right? Emotions that are full of suffering, thoughts that are full of suffering. Our body might feel pain. That's a way of being, right? Excuse me. Actually, within that, within even one emotion, there are so many ways of being. I wouldn't say 100 trillion, but there are so many ways of being even within that moment. But what do you think it might be, only from our perspective, that experience of suffering and pain is worse than, you could say, God's way of being? How good is God's way of being, you could think, in comparison to your way of being? What is the difference? Is it only perspective, maybe? I don't know, I'm just asking the question. Because if you see it as simply that everything is a way of being, and that one way is not better than another way, how can God be better than you? Because that's where it ultimately leads. Like even our mentors, these people that we look up to, how are they better than you? It's only relative from perspective that they're better. Even from the idea of suffering, right? A lot of people suffer. A lot of people experience ways of being that make the human body, the human consciousness experience the suffering. Just went back to Facebook quick to see if there was any comments. Because ultimately, even on the level of consciousness, so this is one of the other things I wanted to get to, was if you see that spirituality, basically what spirituality is that there are all of these levels of consciousness. All right, I'll get to that in a second, CJ. Um, but we are basically, we start from somewhere and then we end up at enlightenment. That's generally the story of spirituality. Maybe not in Christianity or Islam, right? That's a religion. But in spirituality, we believe, okay, you start from where you are and you end up at enlightenment. And that enlightenment is better than where I'm from, where I'm starting. However, if you think of consciousness and that everything happens inside of consciousness, this is why I actually use the difference. I would use the difference between awareness and consciousness, because consciousness with a capital C is the all-pervading isness way of being, the biggest way of being, you could say, even though when I say big, that connotes a size and that it has a limit, but it's a limitless infinity, if that makes any sense. And that we would think that there are smaller consciousnesses with a small c, but I want to use awareness, because things that have minds or limited beings like human beings are aware of consciousness. So awareness can have different levels. Actually, 100 trillion or an infinite amount of quote unquote levels or layers or realms or densities. Those are simply ways of being. And that neither one is inherently better than another. Because ultimately, it's also true that everything is just the consciousness. No matter what kind of way of being you are in a moment, right? You're not a way of being for a lifetime. One lifetime from birth to death, again, has 100 trillion ways of being embedded inside of it. So how can you say that I'm a certain way? Just kind of returning back to that point. But even in the path within human beings, on the path of spirituality, the path of awakening, right? Generally what happens is we have this huge experience, this huge opening, this huge realization. And your awareness kind of expands, or you see society in a whole new way, or you see your shadow, your psychology in a whole new way, or you see the earth, like the flowers, plants, in a whole new way. You could say that your awareness is either expanding, or it's actually your awareness or your ego is contracting a little bit. So it doesn't really matter if you say you're getting bigger or you're getting smaller. It's simply that you're changing a way of being. You're either progressing, you're evolving. I wouldn't say you're getting worse, right? For sure. When you have these big experiences, right, of expansion of awareness or insight, right? But where you started from and where you ended up, what if those are two different ways of being? Rather than saying, I was here and it was terrible, and now I'm here and I'm great, right? However, what if suffering and pain is a characteristic of the way of being as a human being? And that it's natural for human beings to suffer. It's natural for human beings to be ignorant. It's natural for human beings. It's just the way that humans are being. And then when we say that there's not one way of being human, we can't define human beings through a list. Okay, a human is, first of all, a human has 2 legs. Okay, well, there are some humans who don't have 2 legs. Are they still human? Of course, fully human. Humans enjoy music. Okay, well, it's a relative fact. Some humans don't love music. Some humans are deaf, for example. It's deafness. Is that good or bad? Or is it simply a way of being? Blindness. If you really open your mind or open our perspective to the idea of blindness being good or bad, that's from society's perspective. Even the idea of disability, anything of a disability, that's from the perspective of the way of being in which a society is at that time. Disability, ableness, ability means you can do something, right? But what? What are you achieving? In America, right, achievement itself is important from the perspective of Americans. What about uncontacted tribes in the Amazon? Is it their goal to become rich and famous and move to Hollywood or New York City? It's just kind of funny to think about. All right, CJ, we are fractals of God. Very interesting. So yeah, a fractal is the if you can maybe YouTube what a fractal looks like, but basically if you took math class, which most of us did, hopefully, you see that like a fractal continues and it is constantly, not even moment by moment, but it's like constantly opening up to new ways of being. It's like ways of being are being created out of seemingly thin air. And if that's true in our awareness, or if that's what consciousness ultimately is, that means the way our awareness is right now, the way of being of our awareness is not aware of the fractal nature of God or the fractal-like nature of reality or consciousness. Because if everything was an infinite to the infinite power ways of being, how are those being created? So if we agree that like, okay, ultimately, you know, the universe is not physical, it's not what we learned in school. I mean, again, school, you go to school to learn really relative practical things in this society, right? Like, again, if you're in the Amazon with an uncontacted tribe, right, they're not going to be studying the history of Europe. They're not going to be studying the physics of trains, right? How do we know through our way of being, how do we know their way of being? Okay. How can we know? How can we judge them? How can we judge anybody that we label as them when we do not understand their way of being? We only understand our way of being. We can't even understand our way of being because there's 100 trillion ways of being within ourselves, right? So what if all of these infinite ways of being are simply part of this fractal-like nature of God, as CJ says? And that the fractalness is the consciousness. And then within that, there are 100 trillion ways of being created in 100 trillion ways, constantly, outside of time. It's so now that it's outside of now. It's more now than now, because it's outside of time. Now means a certain moment inside of time within the 100 trillion moments. But if you extract that, all of like the beginning of time all the way to end of time, if we argue that time is linear, which our culture does, okay? The beginning of time, the end of time, and you kind of extract that, take it back into meta level, and you see, oh, okay, so time is made up of 100 trillion ways of being, and that theoretically has a start and has an end, okay? But what happened before the start and what happened after the end? You could say that it kind of horseshoes. Let me see if I can, basically like this. There's a Zen painting where you grab a brush, you start at the bottom, you grab a brush and you douse it in black paint. And then you start at the bottom, plop it on the whatever you're painting on, and then try to make a perfect circle like this, and then watch that the paint kind of dissipates as you go around the circle. But then as the paint is dwindling, all of a sudden it returns to the very black part, and it just kind of continues in the circle like this. So what if time was kind of like that? Like the end is the beginning, and that the now is the nowness is what it's all happening inside of. Cyrus Black, thank you. Yeah, so that's kind of the main things I did want to say today in ways of being. And the practical things I want to talk about is how it connects to spirituality. And so how a lot of us experience spirituality in the way that I experience it as well is that it is through like moments. And that either a moment is full of spirituality or a moment doesn't have enough spirituality. So it's like you're constantly going in and out of insight or consciousness from your perspective. Or you're constantly going in and out of the wheel of samsara or ignorance or suffering. So it's this kind of back and forth between feeling good and feeling bad. Also, but we see some progress too on the path. So the progress comes through, so Ken Wilber talks about states and stages. So Ken Wilber says a state is where you have an experience of, say, either an opening, mostly opening, right? In the realm of spirituality, but you can also have a contraction as well. Like if a society goes to war, or basically whenever humans or people are forced to like adapt to an environment, they're pushed to like survive. And for that to happen, right, we kind of get in touch with our fight or flight response, our sense of being human, and things like this. Okay, but then I got to turn off my phone notifications because it gets so distracting. So I lost my train of thought. Oh, so states are experiences, and then stages are basically the embodiment of there. Yeah, Cyrus, you can ask questions for sure. Not promising I can answer them. My answers will probably be very non-answery because questions are always so complex. But yeah, go right ahead. I can see you. Yeah, so anybody on YouTube can ask questions. That's kind of the purpose of these. On Facebook, let me go to Facebook quick to see. Nope, that was a different conversation. Technology is so complex. YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. All right. Yeah. Yep. Go right ahead. I'm going to continue talking about this though. So a stage is like, so if you're going up like this, you have states. So you go up, but then you embody it, kind of flat lines for a while. Say that you go on a 10-day meditation retreat. Okay. And there you have a huge experience. It's happened to a good friend of mine. He went to a 10-day meditation retreat and had a huge opening like a year or two ago. Since then, he's been embodying, like he's been trying to bring that insight into life. That's called embodiment. But it even goes further than that, because inside of your body, this is also what I wanted to say, is inside of your body are, you could say, 100 trillion ways of being inside of your body. So instead of seeing your body as, here's my bicep, here's my thigh, here's my nose tickles. What if your body's actually constantly being made through consciousness, and it's got 100 trillion ways of uniquely being? And then, so you kind of are converting, or basically, yeah, your body is converting to higher states of awareness, because your body is not static, right? Even so, in physics, they say that actually every atom in your body changes every 6 months. So yourself 6 months ago, at the beginning of COVID, was literally every atom that was your body is now has completely new atoms but that's one level. Okay, that's one level of consciousness. So like the atom. Another thing I wanted to say was size. There are an infinite amounts of sizes in the universe, and the atom, the atomic level, is one specific size, you could say. But even within an atom, there are 100 trillion sizes within just an atom. But if we say an atom is the smallest, which it's not, it's obviously not. But if we do say an atom is the smallest, and you go up to the biggest, whatever the Big Bang happened inside of, let's say that's the biggest. There are 100 trillion different sizes. Also, in the realms of consciousness, on Earth, you have animals and plants and humans, all are different species. So each species is a way of being. So my insight into this actually came when I was looking at a colony of ants. And I actually had two really big insights just by looking at a colony of ants. So maybe I'll mention that second point as well. But the first insight was, okay, ants have a certain level of consciousness that I don't understand, that I'm not aware of. But they obviously do. They obviously are in a way of being that I don't understand. And that way of being is at the species level. Each individual is playing a part inside of that colony of ants. So not just the species, but that specific colony is unique from the species. That colony created a consciousness, or that colony created a certain way of being, a Dasein. That colony created a Dasein. Now, that's the same with humans. Like on the humanity level, like if you take all 6 billion people, plus all of the people who have lived, plus all of the people who will live, right? Let's say that's even less than 100 trillion, right? Maybe that's 100 billion people, 100 billion humans. That ultimately, taking all of those 100 billion humans, create the collective consciousness of humanity. Now then you go even smaller to like nations. Like the United States has a collective consciousness or a way of being. And then it continues getting smaller to community, family, you, your body, your mind, the cells in your body, atoms, subatomic, then space. And then that space is the same as the space that the Big Bang happened inside of. Consciousness, oneness, right? So that's how everything is oneness and a specific way of being, a specific Dasein. Recently in an interview I was on a podcast called Happiness Now. Now all capitalized, Happiness Now podcast on YouTube. I was saying that consciousness is infinite in an infinite amount of ways. So like looking at, like I have a little Buddha statue over there. It's infinite because it's literally every part of it is infinite. You could say, what is that Buddha statue? What is it made of? Well, it's made of 100 trillion ways of being. And the Buddha statue, how do you describe that Buddha statue? With words, right? In all of its perfection, like it's perfectly itself. The Buddha statue is perfectly itself. So I was talking about that with the chair at the beginning of the talk. But the Buddha statue is exactly the way it is, not the way that we label it or define it, but simply its own way of being, which inside of its way of being, there are 100 trillion ways of being. So it's infinite. That's true with the universe. When you go big, so that's the micro. Now the macro, okay? We have our universe. But what is our universe happening inside of? You could say, well, it's happening inside of this huge kingdom in which many other universes live or are, or practice their way of being, our Daseins. But what if that set of universes was simply another inside of another set of universes, right? That's true with density of consciousness. Like you say, we live in third density. But how many densities does it go? How do we know, for example, that there's 11 densities only? Or 12 densities? Or however many that we believe, whether you're science or New Age, right? It's a relative perspective. How do we know that there's not more? So that's another thing, is how do you know when you are fully enlightened? What if there's another way of being that you haven't seen? Or even God? How do we know that God is infinite? What if God could become more infinite? All right. All right, let's look at some of these comments here. So junk DNA needs to activate and evolve our human bodies and minds. Good point, CJ. DNA evolves like the movie Lucy. Haven't seen that movie. Our universe is one quantum cloud of many. Nice. So a cloud is a good way of seeing how how our consciousness works. So you have the huge sky, which is, you could say, is ultimately oneness. But then you have all of these clouds constantly reforming, and clouds are simply different ways of being in that moment, right? It's not even, the cloud itself doesn't identify as cloud like we would identify it as cloud. It's simply in the Tao. It's in the constantly reforming itself as an infinite amount of ways of being. And it's all happening inside of the sky. But then you say a quantum cloud. there was something I wanted to say. Yeah, so quantum meaning like, because we don't understand the subatomic level. Subatomic, I mean, so you have biology, chemistry, and physics, which are all different ways of being. Biology studies life. Chemistry studies chemicals, and the smallest that it goes to is the atom or the electron. But in chemistry, it assumes that electron is a thing and that it's not within itself, that an electron within itself has 100 trillion ways of being, and that those ways of being, in science they call that potentiality or probability of it being somewhere. And I think they call it superposition, meaning that an electron has a probability of being somewhere when a human sees, or when awareness becomes aware of it through the subject and object dualism of I see that. Right. So there's lots of things in physics that we can't really understand right now, because we don't see, a lot of people go, well, yeah, people in our culture, we don't see how strong awareness is, and that awareness is like everything, and it could literally mess up a whole theory in physics, just our awareness, because our awareness is fundamental, so much more fundamental than even atoms, at least our idea of atoms, or even quantum clouds. Like quantum clouds is a cloud of physical things. You know, I mean, they're tiny, they're minuscule, but they are still physical in this third density. But those are made of ultimately the experience or the consciousness or the oneness, the fabric of that, the fabricless fabric. All right, densities and dimensions. Yeah. To be honest, I don't know the difference between densities and dimensions, but as for now, I use those interchangeably. Brisket says, what up? I think I know who that is. Quantum financial system. Interesting. So I've heard of quantum computers. Quantum financial system. I'll have to look that up. Yeah, so even finance, like the economy, it's hard to describe what the economy is, because the economy is 100 trillion ways of being, and it's constantly being reformed. It's really hard to interpret the state of something as complex as an economy. Even saying that the economy is good versus the economy is bad, what measures do we make? Like, we could either talk about dollars. You could say, okay, we're going to measure it in dollars. We're going to measure it in stocks. But what if, or unemployment? Well, what if we measure the economy in quality of life, or happiness of the, like, overall happiness? Because that's a way of being, or that's a level of consciousness, is the level of happiness of America. But is there an economist out there who themselves is kind of even a more limited way of being than the economy, or the overall happiness in America? How does one know what that is, especially when the paradigm that we're in is quantifying it? So, like, again, with the Buddha statue, how do I quantify the Buddha statue? How do I quantify the chair or the elephant or the economy? How do I quantify it? Because it's simply a way of being that is constantly changing. And again, that's from only my limited way of being. I can only know mine, and I barely know mine. I barely understand my way of being. It's so complex, and there's so much potential in my way of being that I don't even understand. I have no idea the potential that I carry inside of myself. So how can I even go out to the world and even pretend to understand it if I can't even understand myself, right? The only thing that we can understand is what we all share in common, which is what? What do we all share in common? No matter what, even if you're asleep, even if you're dead, even if you're not born yet, even if you're living in another universe, what does all of that have in common? Okay, I'm just gonna leave that as a question for you. That's the only way that you can know something for certain, right? Is what you ultimately are, and then you realize that what I ultimately am is the same as what everything ultimately is. Right? Economy has different ways of being, but is founded on debt, slavery structures, so it needs to evolve. Nice. So everything, I think, is evolving and changing its way of being. So it's both and. Yes, it's both just changing, but it's also evolving or progressing. I simply just think that's a law of existence, is evolution, progress, spiral. So it was in college when I first understood the idea of that events, life happens in a spiral. Because you could see it as, okay, we're just going in circles. We're just running in circles. So like in Lion King, right? They say life is a circle, or everything is a circle. Time is a circle. Events are a circle. It's generation, generation, generation. So if you think about it, if you didn't know, I'm a high school history teacher. And at the beginning of the course of world history, we talk about the 99% of our history was when we were hunter-gatherers, right? And we didn't have calendars at that time. We didn't even have written language. We didn't really know what was going on. Spiral dynamics, nice. Cyrus Black, nice. So they saw everything as not progressing, even though we see now, well, those 2 million years, over those 2 million years, look at our anatomical structure, look at our brain changing, getting bigger, more intelligence. Our technology improved like crazy over those 2 million years. But again, if you are an individual, a Dasein, or a person, you don't experience yourself the evolution. You don't see evolution happening. Even though I think evolution is happening even faster, I think even time itself is happening faster right now. That's a whole other topic, but we, in our life, we don't see human evolution happening. Because that's an idea, like Homo sapien is an idea. The way that science tries to categorize everything are simply relative ideas. When you look at human history, it's just all a way of being. It's really hard. Like scientists have a hard time saying, okay, that's a species and that's a species, because they can become so similar. And if you look at evolution, like when were we Neanderthals and then all of a sudden now we're Homo sapiens? Where was that point in which a scientist could say, okay, there, if you look at their nose, anything is prior to that is Neanderthal, everything after that is Homo sapien, right? But it's actually so slow and there's such nuance, such complexity in it that you can't point to a point in which we shifted all of a sudden, because evolution happens so slowly. So that's the up. So spiral, yes, it's a circle. Like it. So one of the things I was going to say was Native Americans or hunter-gatherers, right? They learn from their father, they learn from their mother, and then they teach their children. Those children teach their grandchildren. So the idea of 7 generations forward, 7 generations back. So Native Americans don't view themselves really as individuals per se. They view themselves as tribe. They view themselves as we. I am a we. I am a part of those 7 generations forward, 7 generations back. So that's if you look at it from that perspective, Native Americans tend to believe that they are a part of this circle of life. Everything's a circle. Everything goes in cycles. Everything goes in cycles. Also in astrology, they say everything goes in cycles. Everything goes in cycles. I don't know enough about astrology to say they also believe in progress. I don't know. But I do believe in progress too. So spiral dynamics, as Cyrus Black says. So spiral dynamics says yes and. So yes, things seem to be just circular, but they're also progressing. So both are true. So currency exchanges making other countries remain more impoverished in the third world. Yeah, so that's also, so how I'll take that is just the idea of the third world or poor countries. So how we become more open-minded through this way of thinking as a way of being rather than scientific interpretation, you could say. I guess I'm kind of explaining a whole different way of exploring reality that's different than the scientific method that most people see as the superior method. If you see the world through ways of being, all of a sudden the third world becomes so complex that you can't judge it anymore from our American perspective. I mean, forget about the fact that we can't even understand America. I can't even understand Minnesota. I can't understand my community because it's just so complex. It has 100 trillion ways of being within it. But then when you go to somewhere that you've never been, the only thing you know about it is that it exists. And that's the only thing that we have in common is the existence part of it. But then when you're at a certain level or way of being that we call culture or country or travel, now all of a sudden you don't understand it. Like, for example, I used to live in Ecuador. I thought when I would go to Ecuador for a year and a half that I would become super fluent in Spanish and that I would understand so much about Ecuador. And I realized I put in so much effort studying Spanish, for example. And I realized that Spanish is so complex and so hard that it would take a whole, I should have just been born in Ecuador to understand it. Like Spanish is so complex that those who speak Spanish don't understand the complexities of it. Because for you, English, right? I'm assuming English is your first language, maybe not. But do you ever remind yourself that you are speaking English? I forget that all the time that I'm speaking English because it just comes so naturally. My awareness is at some other way of being, not the way of being that we call languaging or language. So in Spanish, they have lenguaje or idioma. So they distinguish language that in English we just say language. But then, so this like Spanish is so complex, and then the culture of Ecuador is so complex because it's full of all of these different people. Like you have the indigenous people, the mestizo people, the white tourists, the rich people. And I was trying to figure out what does it mean to be Ecuadorian? And I realized no one knows. No one knows what it means to be Ecuadorian. It's just there's an isness, a je ne sais quoi of everything. It just is. It's a way of being. And we just know it as a way of being. We don't know it as the interpretation of it, like I said. All right, so Cyrus Black. Kyle, is the universe emotional or mental? Yes. The universe, I guess I don't quite understand your question, but I mean, yes, the universe is emotional and mental. I would say that emotion is a level of awareness. The mind is a level of awareness that has it's connected to the brain, but it doesn't come from the brain. So we don't need a brain in order for there to be emotion. It's that things like emotion, mind, thinking are and intelligence are natural parts of the universe, natural parts of existence. So those were here before what we call human beings came into being. Human beings simply evolved inside of this sandbox, or this like creative, if you just imagine like a room that was like this huge gigantic room that was made for ultimate creativity. Like the purpose was for evolution and creativity. That's basically like what we're living in here in the universe. And that's the purpose, from what I see, is that we have this huge gigantic room with all these like gadgets and furniture, technology, but not just physical, but like as Cyrus Black says, emotional or mental as well, consciousness. And Cyrus, if your question is like within emotion, does there's like love and happiness, does the universe experience it? I would say yes, but it's because reality is made of love. It's made of happiness. Those are characteristics of existence itself. All right, CJ, thanks for joining. Have a good night. Much love to you as well. Cyrus Black, I tried learning French here in Canada too. It's hard, yeah. Yep, learning a second language is really hard. And then just knowing that you can't be French, you can't be Ecuadorian unless you're really from there. You can kind of begin to form a new sense of self. Like I've always thought that like there's a Spanish side to me and then an English side to me. Those are two different ways of being. If I tried to come up on this channel and began to speak Spanish, my personality would change slightly because I'm speaking Spanish. Right, so do our emotions create our perception? I would say the other way around, actually, because perception is more immediate. Emotion, you can only call it emotion when you are aware of the emotion. So emotions are simply ways of being until we say, oh, that's sadness. Oh, that's guilt. Or, oh, that's happiness. So it's not an emotion until we label it as such from our perspective. And I think that's what you're saying, actually. So instead of perception, I would say perspective. But perception, yes, it's the same thing. Yeah. But what emotions truly are is consciousness, or ways of being. And they tend to, well, not emotions, but what we call emotions are constantly coming in and out of our body and interacting with the environment. Because that's another way of being, is the emotional level. Or the emotional level is a certain body that we have. That's one level. The mind is a body you could say that we have. That is another level. Awareness is another one. Pain and suffering and bodily feelings is another level or way of being. And all of these ways of being are like a system, or they happen inside of, they function like a system. So emotions just come in and out of our bodies, in and out of our bodies. And often for people who might not do a lot of yoga or meditation, emotions tend to get, or there's stuckness in the body, that we haven't fully experienced that emotion yet. It's been suppressed through our psychology, and we tend to like store it somewhere in our body. So like discernment. What exactly is discernment? I mean, discernment really is similar to judgment, right? I mean, you're saying discernment is when you say, this is what that is, and that is what that is. So discernment is relative from your mind. So emotions, yeah. I guess one thing I would say about emotions is you don't need to label it though for it to be an emotion. It can simply be felt without a story attached to it. And that I would say tends to be people who do yoga and meditation, they tend to be a little bit better at that than those who feel emotions and there's always a story or a worry attached to the emotion. That's basically because there's so many patterns that have been built over time in your body and in your brain. So like when the environment happens in a certain way, like if there's a stimulus, say that there's ice cream in the room and you instantaneously want ice cream. That's because that's just a pattern that we have in our body and in our brain for liking ice cream. But that can change over time. That can definitely change over time. Like if you do yoga meditation and you continue to eat ice cream, but then you notice that it doesn't make you feel good. That first time where you finally noticed, okay, yeah, ice cream does give me stomach aches or something like that. But then all of a sudden now you find yourself choosing to eat less ice cream, even if it's like at a staff meeting, everyone's eating ice cream and you say, no thanks, I'll pass, right? So that's like not allowing any emotion to take you over, because the emotion is simply a way of being that we don't need to attach to, really, not necessarily. It can just kind of flow in and flow out, you could say, of our awareness or of our body. All right. Well, great. So yeah, I'm glad that you guys are checking in, watching this. So Tuesday Talks, I'm gonna go live 6:30 Central Time, US, live on Facebook. So if you're on just on YouTube for me, you can check out Facebook, the Spiritual Download. I have a new page there that you can like, and then I'm constantly putting links on there. So for example, I do blogs. I'm writing a book. I'll be talking more about my book in the future, but I'm putting like little excerpts. I'm putting little excerpts of my book on my blog. So if you want to see those excerpts, I link those onto my Facebook page, or else you could come check out spiritualdownload.org itself. That's where my blog is. And yeah, so that's kind of where I communicate, is my blog, Facebook page. I'm also on Instagram, not as much as I am on YouTube and Facebook though. So yeah, and these are done on Zoom meetings. So there's a meeting code if you want to check that out. There's a meeting code that I'll put out. It'll be the same one. I'll put it out every week to remind people that today's the Tuesday Talk at 6:30. So just trying to be more consistent with in life and on with the spiritual download. So yeah, okay. Cyrus, I guess I don't understand your question. How often are your lives? Oh, how often? Yeah, so Tuesdays. So every week. I'll let you know if a certain Tuesday doesn't work, because that means I'm probably like on vacation or something, or sick. But you can kind of assume every Tuesday at 6:30 I'll be doing a live. Okay. I'll also continue doing uploads. Um, for example, I just put out a 15-minute guided meditation. Um, that's for people who are either beginning or have been meditating it for a year or two. Um, yeah, you can go check out that 15-minute meditation. Basically, it'll show you um, my what I've learned through my time with meditation. It's basically you can understand the feeling I'm trying to kind of, I guess, the feeling that I get into, or the awareness I get into through those meditations. Um, Basically, it's a combination of all these different meditations I've studied. Um, yeah, come early. Usually I'm like 2 minutes late to everything, so 6:32. Um, so yeah, check out that meditation, because that'll help you like see what I mean by 100 ways of being, because a meditation itself is 100 ways of being, and you'll see that through it. I don't. It's not like I have you focus on one thing the whole time. It's literally like you're bouncing around your whole field of awareness. You're going to the big, the small, focus, concentration, and then expand. Um, and that's kind of how I'll be explaining meditation in the future. And then if you do it yourself, ultimately what I say is it's about experience. It's really about experience. It has nothing to do with like what I'm saying, really. What I'm saying is just a pointer. In Zen, they say everything's like Zen is a finger that's pointing to the moon, and that what life really is the moon. It's not the pointing to it. All right. Um, so have a good night. I'll see you guys next week. Peace.